This is our 21st lesson in the study of Old Testament history. Israel has been in Egypt for hundreds of years, but now they're about to leave. I think it'd be good as we study the Exodus, and that'll be our study for the next 2 lessons, the Exodus experience. It'd be good for us to go back and think about what's happened in Goshen, in the city of Ramesses, where Israel has been living and working for now several hundred years. Joseph, if you remember, had been sold into slavery by his brothers. After spending some time in the house of the captain of the guard and being tempted by his wife, by the captain of the guard's wife, and then framed by her, he spent some time in prison where he met a cupbearer and a baker. The cupbearer finally remembered him and brought him into Pharaoh's house, and he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, and Pharaoh made Joseph prime minister, governor of all of the land at age 30. For 80 years, Joseph will be number 2 in all of the empire, and before long, number 2 in all the world. He brings his family to Egypt, and they're given the best of the land, that is for shepherds, the land of Goshen. They increase and become a mighty people with great flocks and great herds, and Egypt is afraid of them. Besides that, they're really too soft for the long journey and the arduous fight for promised land. So God has them put under oppression, and Egypt greatly oppresses them, and they work in building the great store cities of Pithom and Ramses and many more. Finally, Moses is born, and Moses tries to deliver prematurely the people when he's 40 years of age. Stephen said in his sermon in Acts 7 that he just supposed that they'd know that he was the leader that was to bring them out of captivity, but it was not time. Israel nor Moses was ready. And so God drove Moses to Mount Sinai, where for 40 years he learns the arduous job. He was no longer Pharaoh's daughter's son. He's now simply the servant of Reuel or Jethro, the priest of Midian. There he gets a wife, Zipporah, and 2 sons. Now he's ready to go back. He is hardened. He is sufficiently in love with God and has enough faith in God to deliver Israel from Egypt's bondage. And God calls him, but now he's reluctant to go. Finally, after all of his reluctance is broken down, he goes back to Egypt, and with 10 plagues breaks Pharaoh's back. And finally, Pharaoh has calls for Aaron and Moses to come to him, and the Exodus begins. If you'll open to Exodus chapter 12, we'll begin reading with verse 31. The 10th plague has been performed. All of the gods of Egypt are out of the running. And finally, Pharaoh's own house, the great house, is emptied of his firstborn son. So during the night, verse 31 of chapter 12, during the night, it doesn't wait till morning. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and says, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites, go. Worship the Lord as you've requested. Take your flocks and your herds as you've said, and go. And also bless me." There's one time that Pharaoh got close to having a soft heart, when he said the words, "and also bless me." Notice the attitude of the people, the Egyptians, in verse 33. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, or otherwise, they said, "we will all die." So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked. So they plundered the Egyptians. They've been in captivity, but they go out not as slaves. They go out as honored people. They go out with the blessing of God. They go out with the command of Pharaoh. They go out with the goodwill of the people. They go out with the gold and the silver and the clothing of Egypt. They have despoiled the Egyptians. Joseph had made Pharaoh rich. Moses makes Pharaoh poor. Now as they leave Ramesses, the Exodus itself actually begins in chapter 12 and verse 37. Now the Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth. That's not a city. The word Succoth simply means booth, and there they will pitch their first booths or their first tents. The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, as well as large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. I want you to think about that journey, that day. If there's 600,000 men, besides women and children, the women and children always outnumber the men. There's at least 1.2 or 1.3 million Jews leaving that land. And how many went in just a few hundred years ago? 75. God has greatly blessed Israel in Goshen. And besides that 1.2 or 1.3 million Jews, there's many other people. If I was a slave in Egypt and slaves were leaving, I think I'd mingle myself in the crowd to get out of Egypt. And many other people go up. And not only that, but large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. I think it would take all day long, wouldn't it, for that many people to leave a land on foot or in cart. With the dough, and now look at verse 39, they leave with the dough they brought from Egypt. They baked cakes of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they'd been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. How long had they been there? I've said hundreds of years, but how long? Verse 40 states it. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the large divisions left Egypt. They came out to the day 430 years after they had gone down. Now I don't know if that means Joseph's going down or Jacob's coming down, but 430 years. Because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt on this night, all the Israelites are to keep vigil to honor the Lord for the generations to come. They are to be vigilant and alert people, and they are to observe this day in remembrance of that. Now, in verse 43, some Passover restrictions are given because they are to observe from now on the day that they ate the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs, and the day that the Lord passed over them when He destroyed all the firstborn of Egypt. And here are some restrictions that are to be observed. Look at verse 43. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, these are the regulations for the Passover. No foreigner is to eat of it. Any slave who you have brought may eat of it after you've circumcised him, but a temporary resident and a hired worker may not eat of it. It said it must be eaten inside of one house, and none of the bones of the animal is to be broken, and everybody in all of Israel is to celebrate it. Verse 50. All the Israelites did just what the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, and on that day the Lord brought the Israelites out of Egypt by their divisions. Then in chapter 13, you've got the consecration of the firstborn. Beginning in, let's start in verse 1, yes. The Lord said to Moses, consecrate to me every firstborn male, the first offspring of every womb belongs to me, whether man or woman. Then they are to commemorate that day, and they are to observe a feast that day, the feast of the Passover. They are to eat nothing containing yeast. They are to do it in honor of the fact that God has not only passed over their firstborn, but has now caused them to pass out of their slavery and their captivity. And when they get into the land, verse 11, that He's bringing them to, they are to there also offer this sacrifice unto God. And when any time, verse 14, one of your sons say, what does this mean? Why are we eating this unleavened bread and these bitter herbs and this spotless lamb? Why are we doing this? Say unto them, with a mighty hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed every firstborn in Egypt, both man and animal. This is why I sacrifice to the Lord the first male offering of every womb, and redeem each of my firstborn sons. And it will be a sign on your head and your forehead that the Lord has brought you out of Egypt with a mighty hand. In 13 verse 20, it says, after leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. That'd be the wilderness of Shur. Notice here they begin to be led by the Lord by a cloud and a pillar. By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they might travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in the front of the people. We read on other occasions also that this cloud and pillar covered them at night. So the cloud would shield them from the hot desert sun in the daytime, and the fire would give them warmth from the cold desert night. And so God was not only leading them, He was providing for their comfort and their need. They leave Etham. They're told to leave Etham in chapter 14, and they journey to a place called Pihahiroth near Migdol and the sea. And as they encamp there, Pharaoh has decided that he made a mistake in letting all of his slaves go. So he gets all of his chariots and all of his army to go with him, and he goes out in the desert to recover them. And he took 600, verse 7 of chapter 14 says, he took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with their officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, so he pursued the Israelites, the Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, all Pharaoh's horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they encamped near Pihahiroth. As Pharaoh approaches, the Israelites look up and they're filled with great fear. They turn against Moses, and they come to Moses and said, "Didn't we say to you in Egypt, let us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians? It would be better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in this desert." Moses is courageous, and he tells the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see this day the deliverance of the Lord. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." He says in verse 13, the Lord will fight for you. You need only to stand still. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and said, "Why are you crying out to me? Raise your staff and stretch your hand over the sea to divide the water, so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so that they will go after them. I will gain for myself glory through Pharaoh and all of his army. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." I love the statement in verse 19, because it tells me that not only has a pillar of fire and a cloud gone before them during the night and the day, but God has been there also, the angel of God. Verse 19, then the angel of God, who'd been traveling in front of them, came and stood behind them between Egypt and Israel throughout all the night as they tried to overtake the Israelites. They were held back by the angel of God. And Moses stretched his hand with a rod in it over the sea, and a strong east wind blew and turned it into dry ground, with a wall of water on the right hand and a wall of water on the left. I've always tried to imagine that, as if I were an Israelite passing through there. And there are the fish, the huge fish, as they're trying to swim toward the Red Sea, the major sea, and they're running into this barrier. And as I pass, I see these fish as they're trying to get through this wall of water, and they cannot. And there's a wall on both sides of me going up higher, of course, much higher than my head. It would have been a fearful and a fearsome day. My bones would have quaked. My knees would have knocked, but I would have gone. Why? Because Moses is ahead of me. The leader has taken the lead in Israel, and the people are following the leader. Praise ye the Lord. That day, all 1.3 or 4 million Jews pass over. All the great multitude that with them passed over. All the flocks and all the herds passed over. And God released Pharaoh and his army. And they ran into the valley. Yes, it was a valley formed by the walls, formed by the water of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba. And when all of Israel was on dry ground, God spoke, and the waters came together. And and all of Pharaoh's chariots, and all of Pharaoh's horses, and all of Pharaoh's army died. It is an archaeological fact that in the Gulf of Aqaba there is a level place underneath the water that would be sufficient for this kind of a horde of people to pass over. And in that level place are the ruins of chariots and chariot wheels. Pharaoh and his army were devoured by the sea. That's the two. Literally devoured by God, because Pharaoh and his people had touched the apple of God's eye. The other side of that Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba, they're going to need water. And they come to a place where there are some springs of water, but they find out very quickly that these waters are mara, which is the Hebrew word for bitter or poisonous. And then God has Moses make that water pure so that the people can drink. And God begins to tell his people the story that he'll tell for 40 long years. 38 from this point, 38 from Sinai, excuse me. That is that I am with you. I will preserve you. Their clothes will not get old. Their shoes will not wear out. They'll be fed with bread from heaven, water from the rock. They'll be fed with quail that God stacks up 3 foot deep. God will take care of those people, whether or not they are faithful to him, because he's made a promise to Abraham. Only a faithful two will enter promised land, but God will preserve out of 1.23 million people, only a faithful two will enter promised land. But God will take care of this people because he has made a promise. He has made a covenant to Israel. They journey from Marah to a place called Elim, and there are 12 springs and 70 palm trees. You know, at first that sounds good, but unless God miraculously continues the 12 springs of water among 1.2 million, and then you add the rest, nearly 2 million people, is going to be a mockery. And 70 palm trees will not provide the dates to feed 2 million people. God is trying to tell them this land cannot sustain you. There's not enough crop. There's not enough water for this in this whole land to sustain you. I will be the one. I will be the Lord who sustains you. They learn this at the springs of Elim. They come to the wilderness called the wilderness of Sin. It's spelled S-I-N as if it were sin, but it's literally the wilderness of Sin. And there it is that they will sin, because there they murmur against Moses. You'll read this in chapter 16 of the book of Exodus. If you will, turn over there and let's read starting with verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they'd come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled. I love that word. It literally sounds like what you do, grumble, grumble. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around with pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." It is a historical fact that freed slaves do not know what to do with their freedom. They're longing for the flesh pots of Egypt because they don't have the food that their evil heart and their body desires. So verse 4 of chapter 16, the Lord said to Moses, "I'll rain down bread from heaven. The people are to go out each day and gather enough that day. On the 6th day, they are to prepare what they bring in. That is to be twice as much as they gather on other days." God's about to give them a day called the Sabbath day, which they'll learn to remember that they have been delivered from Egypt's bondage, and they are to rest and serve the Lord on that day. They go out that next morning and they find flakes on all of the bushes, and they gather those flakes and they can bake them and make bread out of them. And as they look at it, they say, "Manhu, what is this?" And so from then on they called it manna, which means what is this? They ate what is this the rest of the time that they're going to be in Egypt. They didn't know where it came from, except that it came from God. They didn't know what it was, except that it would sustain their life. They didn't know what to do with it until God told them to bake it and make bread out of it. And then they were sustained by the thing that came from God that they did not understand, that they did not provide, that they did not know how to use until God told them to do it. God's teaching them. And by teaching them, teaching us, that the only way that we're going to be able to sustain ourselves in this unfriendly environment of the world. We live in the heavenly places, but those heavenly places are in the world. And the only way that we're going to be able to sustain ourselves in this unfriendly environment is learn by His grace, to trust His grace, and to use whatever provision He gives to us for that day. That's why Jesus, when He taught His disciples to pray, says begin this way: Our Father which art in heaven, give us this day our daily bread. That is a daily prayer. That is a morning prayer for the bread of that single day. That's all the Lord has promised, and that's all the Lord has promised to provide, is the bread for this day. Now, He not only provides manna, though. They complain about that. And they say, all we've got to eat is this manna. And so God gives them quail. And He gives them quail not for a day or two, but He gives them quail until it stacks up 2 cubits high. That is 3 feet high. God stacks up this quail. Some people believe they're flying 3 foot high so He can catch them. I don't believe that's it. I believe that God kills enough quail that first day anyway, or that they have quail that goes to rot. They're being taught again that God provides not for the future, but for today. That they are to have the bread for today, and they're to have the meat for the day, and they're to have the water for the day. In chapter 17, they come to a place called Rephidim, and they camp there, but there's no water for the people. So in 17 verse 2, so they quarreled. They had grumbled, and now they're quarreling. So they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And so Moses, or actually the Lord, does bring them water out of the rock. And they call that place Massa or Meribah, because that means quarreling or contention. Israel is a complaining, grumbling, quarreling people, for they're freed slaves, and they do not know what to do with their slavery. Also here in chapter 17, they meet a people called Amalek, or the Amalekites. These people are on their way to defeat the Egyptians. There is a pillar that was found that describes the coming of the Amu at this time, who brought Egypt to their knees. So they're coming to destroy Egypt that Israel has just despoiled. They're coming to take over for a while. So this is not just some small tribal people. This is a huge army of people that now faces Israel. Joshua is going to come forward now as the general of God's people. He'd been and will be Moses' servant, Moses' right-hand man. But now he becomes what he was called by God to be. That is the general of the army of God. They go down to fight the Amalekites in the valley below Rephidim. And Moses stands up on the top of the mountain and holds his hands up in the air with the rod in his hands. And as he holds that rod up, the Amalekites are defeated in the valley below. And when that rod goes down, Israel is defeated. You can't hold your hands up for long. And so Aaron and Hur is Miriam's husband, stand on both sides of him and hold his hands up in that rod until finally Joshua has defeated the Amalekites in the valley below. And it is a day greatly to be remembered by God. And Amalek goes on to defeat Egypt, and Israel goes on to inherit the promised land. And as he travels toward the promised land, Jethro, his father-in-law, comes out to meet him, and he watches what Moses does all day long. Moses sits in the tent of meeting, and all of Israel lines up to be counseled, to have their problems solved. But when the day is over, most of them have gone home without seeing Moses. And so Jethro asked Moses, what is this you're doing? And Moses told him. And Jethro said, what you're doing is not good. Moses is offended. So what do you mean not good? I'm giving these people the best advice they can have. And he says, that's right. But most of them go home without advice. What you need to do, and the Lord has told me to tell you this, is you need to divide Israel and put captains over 10, and put captains over 50, and put captains over 100, and put captains over 1,000, and that'd get up to the tribal divisions. Then you'd have the family heads and the tribal heads, and finally the head of each single tribe. So what you need to do is delegate some of that authority. That's true in any situation among God's people. We need to get the kingdom of God, the church of the Lord, needs to be so organized that every 10th person is a caregiver, and nobody is responsible for over 10 people, and everybody can get answers to their problem from the one that's above them, and if he can't solve it, the one that's above him, and if he can't solve it, the one that is above him, and finally it'll get to the elders, the bishops, the leaders of the people of God, and then finally submitted, if necessary, to God himself. The Word, of course, will always be the guide, but we need to so work and so live that we are our brother's keeper. God help us not to make the mistake that Moses made in Egypt.